How's everyone doing? Oh, I think you must be on mute. I couldn't quite hear you. Let's try that again. No, it's great to be here in person and to see everyone and not to have to worry about whether half of you are in your bed or wearing pants or not. I'm Dan Rejto. I'm the Director of Food and Agriculture at the Breakthrough Institute. It's an environmental think tank that's based just across the bay in Berkeley, and we identify, analyze, and advocate for technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. And one of those that we've been one of those solutions has been alternative proteins. So my background, I have about a decade's worth of experience in the food and ag industry across different businesses, but really for the past 3 or 4 years at Breakthrough, we've been doing a lot of work on alternative proteins, both analyzing their environmental potential and also communicating to policymakers both why they're important and really how to advance the field. And we've been hearing a lot more recently, we've been hearing a lot more recently, I think, in discussions both with policymakers and many of you about the potential social implications of cultured meat and alternative proteins in general. This morning, for instance, Nikki Quinn brought up how Ala Farms is committed to a just transition. That's something I want to dig into more. Now, it might seem premature. Alternative proteins make up some 1% of the market, and cultured meat 0.0%, as someone said yesterday. But I think it's really important to still really consider the labor implications and how to develop a vision for just transition, given the industry's ambitions and projections, really, of radically changing the protein production landscape, and also given the challenges that we've seen in similar industries under transition, such as the energy industry. Now, this is me out there on the right. You can't quite see, but I had a lot more hair back then. This is 9 years ago at a rally I helped organize to help shut down a coal plant in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was a really terrible plant. We talked to residents there, and the soot from this coal facility would line the kitchen walls and the outdoor walls of people's homes. And for years, both before this rally and after this rally, there were more rallies and marches and petitions, and Greenpeace held up a banner on the kind of smokestack of the plant trying to shut it down. And yet, it stuck around year after year after year. And only this past summer did it finally close down. And one of the reasons was that, of course, like any other facility, there were people employed there, and those people wanted to keep their jobs. Businesses were concerned about those people and their friends keeping their jobs, and politicians, of course, didn't want the unions and energy companies going after them in the next election. So the plant was only replaced once there was a commitment to replace it with a natural gas plant that created additional jobs. And I think we'll start to see more of these dynamics at play in the protein transition. There are already fears being amplified and communicated from the incumbent livestock and meat processing industries. And those fears aren't entirely unfounded either. Agriculture has a long history, really, of unemployment due to technological changes. Since the 1940s and 50s, we've seen a doubling of production in this country of food, while the amount of labor that's necessary has fallen fourfold. And alternative proteins, very broadly, and cultured meat specifically, really creates a pretty substantial risk, I'd say, for these industries. Many of them view alternative proteins eventually, in the long term, not today, not next year, but in the long term, as an existential risk. And there are quite high stakes, if you'll pardon the terrible wordplay. There's over 700,000 farms in the country with beef cows, 200,000 or so poultry producers, and more than 500,000 people who I think we often overlook, and many people in food discussions overlook, working in meat processing plants as trimmers, slaughterers, meat packers. That's a lot of people. That's 10 times the number, at least, as the amount of people working in the coal mining industry. And not to be a downer, but we've seen how politically obstructive coal miners, their representatives, their companies have been. Even today, we see Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia holding up historic climate legislation, in part because it threatens the coal interests in his state. So I think we'll see overall similar political challenges in the future in the protein transition. Meat processing is concentrated in a few states, as this map shows, primarily in the Midwest, in California, and Texas, although that doesn't show up. Yet there's some amount of meat processing in most states, in many communities around the country, and therefore a lot of political power that, a lot of political interest across the country, really, in maintaining the status quo and pushing back against any type of transition. But the ramifications of an alternative protein transition aren't just political, they're also, of course, human. Now, many of the implications of shifting people out of meat processing into other industries, whether it's alternative proteins or entirely outside the food system, would be beneficial. Working in a meat processing plant is undoubtedly terrible by most standards. There are an average of 2 amputations, mostly of people's fingers, per week, which is both tragic and, I think, entirely unnecessary. And at the same time, it's important to reduce the suffering that might come from any type of unemployment, any type of layoff, any type of transition. Layoffs typically result in loss of insurance, depression, stress, other mental health disorders, not to mention financial stress. And most of the people working on these lines are also socially and economically disadvantaged. They're disproportionately Black, Latinx, foreign-born, living under the poverty line. So a major shift in employment could have substantial implications for these hundreds of thousands of people. But the question I think many of us ask is whether there will be any type of transition for workers. Will the growth of alternative proteins, will cultured meat actually somehow displace jobs? Will it only create jobs? Is that possible? I think collectively as a community, we need to explore these questions more and really be more public about our vision for the future. So one factor that affects whether cultured meat and alternative proteins will displace jobs is whether it will actually displace meat consumption. It's possible that instead of replacing meat consumption, like poultry recently, it will just add to it. We'll just see per capita consumption of beef, chicken, et cetera, stay the same. And maybe people will start eating also 10 pounds of lobster per year. We'll see. However, the whole premise of, I think, this industry, this enterprise, is to displace a substantial share of existing production. That's the only way in which there can be substantial environmental, animal welfare, and worker benefits. So I think as we try to articulate a vision for the broader movement and industry, thinking 10, 20, 30 years down the line when we might reach more than 1% market share, I think we need to take seriously the concerns of people in the industry right now who are worried about it affecting levels of production and actually eating into their business. Still, however, some type of shift, especially to cultured meat, could create more jobs than it disrupts. According to all of the technoeconomic assessments from Delft, from David Humbert, and others, cultured meat production at scale, at commercial scale, not just in the lab, will require perhaps 2 to 3 times the amount of jobs per pound of meat, or per 500,000 tons of meat, as it's typically modeled in these studies. Now, I'm a researcher. I'm typically quite skeptical of most estimates I see, including these. I think the labor costs may need to come down over time for cultured meat to be financially and economically feasible, but nevertheless, it's possible to envision a future where some type of broad-scale transition results in a similar, perhaps slightly greater number of jobs. And yet, that doesn't mean that there won't be substantial disruption for workers. It's quite, I think, unclear right now, before companies scale up, whether people's skills and backgrounds will be transferable. So McKinsey, in a recent study, estimated that somewhere on the order of 10 to 20% of jobs in cultured meat would be bioprocessing engineer roles that really have no analog in the conventional livestock and meat processing industry. And similarly, the largest share, some 40% of jobs in meat processing and slaughtering are on the line, are slaughtering jobs, meat trimming, cutting, packing jobs that also have no real analog in the future protein economy, in plant-based or in cultured meat production facilities. These people perhaps can be retrained, perhaps can work as supervisors or monitoring production lines and processes, but it's still quite unclear. And even if they are able to be retrained and can find some type of landing in the industry, the other factor that's at play here is location. So currently, no one's really talking too much, perhaps besides culture decadence in the Midwest, about locating facilities in rural, predominantly meatpacking regions. Most production is in Singapore and Israel and the Bay Area. Now, I expect that to change over time, but there's nothing really inevitable about cultured meat or even plant-based meat facilities being located in these areas. That's really a choice that is incumbent upon really upon businesses where they'll locate, and in part upon policymakers who can provide incentives for companies to locate in one place or another. So in short, I think the challenge I'm describing here is that while cultured meat and this broader alternative protein transition in general could create more jobs, could lead to more jobs, they're both different jobs and potentially jobs in different places. Now, I don't want to leave us on a down note by any means. I think there's a lot that this whole community can do to articulate a positive pro-worker vision for a just transition. And some of those ideas are already being put into play. There are a number of efforts to help livestock producers, poultry producers, ranchers, and others shift into other markets. So of course, Mercy for Animals, which is perhaps the best known effort, their transformation project is working with poultry producers to help them sell into the hemp market, to shift out of poultry production. And perhaps a lesser known example is the American Prairie Reserve, which is operating in the Great Plains, primarily purchasing land from ranchers, really thousands of acres of land, to create the largest nature reserve in the contiguous US, really transitioning those people out of ranching and into a conservation economy. But that doesn't address the workers. There's a lot that can be done too to help employ former meat workers. Besides locating facilities nearby them and trying to hire more meat workers, nonprofits also have a role to play here. And some of them are already starting to arise. So the Brave New Life Project is one example. They're based in Colorado and try and work with people who want to leave the meat processing industry. They provide job assistance, financial assistance, labor aid. This is the type of model that could scale up. However, given the scale of the project, or of the problem really, the challenge here, transitioning tens or hundreds of thousands of people, not in the next year, again, not in the next 5 or 10 years, but really over a long time into this alternative protein economy, really there's a need for government intervention. This is what we're seeing in the clean energy transition right now. So recently there's been a couple pieces of legislation introduced to help fossil fuel workers who are getting laid off, providing them with wage supplements, financial aids for education, as well as retraining and other types of support. These are the models, I think, that the alternative protein community can learn from. Another much more controversial idea would be government support or subsidies actually for the livestock industry to increase exports. Now, I fully expect to see these proposals, mostly coming from the livestock industry. We see that in fossil fuels, certainly with subsidies for natural gas exports. And I'm sure the cattle industry is already talking about trying to increase existing USDA support for exports. But there's actually a way in which environmental and animal welfare groups may, to some degree, come around to this idea too. If we're thinking about the challenge of feeding the world by 2050 or 2100 or any time frame really, there's a massive scale up in demand for meat. Some people throw around numbers that will need 70% more meat, 100% more meat by 2100 to meet demand. Either way, production in the US is typically both environmentally more friendly as well as in terms of animal welfare and labor welfare. Although the standards are quite low, they're nevertheless sometimes better than those in other countries. And so to meet that growing demand, there may be a case for more of that production to occur here in the US rather than in other countries with lower standards. But whatever the specific policies and efforts that we see from companies and governments and nonprofits, ultimately I think it's actually quite urgent for this community to develop this type of vision for a just transition. The impacts to workers may be far in the future, perhaps farther than any of us can see. However, there's already a lot of opposition that we see from the incumbent industry that must be addressed to some degree. So the livestock industry, of course, sees these proposals from companies as an existential threat, as this economically disastrous, and many of their representatives are following their lead in introducing legislation that many of us are familiar with to obstruct marketing of alternative proteins. But even supporters of alternative protein, even some of the legislators who are really gung-ho about it, are coming to me and groups like the Breakthrough Institute and Good Food Institute and asking, so what are the job implications? What will happen to workers in our communities, in our states, in other states? These are questions that really need to be addressed as well. I think some of the first steps that we can take are to support more research in this field. There's practically no evidence that alternative proteins will be economically disastrous for livestock, but there's also no evidence that it won't be. There's practically no research in this field. And part of it is that we can't predict the future, of course, but we can develop some models and projections and scenarios to help people understand what are possible futures. I'd say the second big step that can be taken is to work together collaboratively to develop a pro-worker, forward-looking vision for a just transition. And that vision can include many of the things I've talked about before, some of those policy interventions, siting facilities near workers, and hopefully also starting to engage early on with unions, because at least in the meat processing industry, most workers actually are unionized. They get higher wages and greater benefits due to their union representatives. And that is the type of future we should really want to see, the same types of benefits, same type of wage increases, or more. Really, we should want to see even a greater economic welfare for the cultured meat workers of the future. In short, ultimately, I think we need to not just communicate a vision of how cultured meat is good for animals and the environment, or for consumers, or for investors, but also for workers too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. If you have any questions, feel free to use the microphone Hi, thank you for giving the presentation. I'm Evan Koss from St. Joseph's University. You'd mentioned retraining programs for farmers and meat packers. In America specifically, the average farmer is in their late 50s. How do you think programs should best go about trying to convince them that it's worth retraining at their age?
That's a great question. I think that the question really here of timescales is just incredibly difficult to think about. Overall, perhaps unlike some, I guess, boosters, imagine these industries growing relatively slowly over time. I don't think there will be some overnight shift. So there will be some people who will just age out of these industries. So there will be farmers who perhaps will operate for the next 10 years, and they may see decreasing margins or less demand for their products, but will manage to stay in business and not necessarily need to transition out. I think the same goes for some workers, some meat processing workers, but at the same time, there will be, if there is increasing demand for meat alternatives, some growing pressure on this industry that may require some businesses to shut down eventually, and certainly businesses to transition from kind of livestock and typical animal-based meats into alternatives.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan.
Hi.
Great presentation. You touched upon co-workers being displaced earlier in your presentation by alternative energy or just environmental concerns. I was wondering if there are any other fields or industries, sort of in industrialized or post-industrialized America, that are being similarly affected that we might be able to learn from.
Great. So the question was really whether there are other industries that we might be able to learn from that are experiencing some types of transitions. And to be honest, I guess my expertise is really more in the energy transitions than any other industry. There are some agricultural and food products from the past that we've transitioned away from. So perhaps it's not agricultural, but a long time ago, there was a transition, of course, from like whale oil to kerosene. Really, there have been many energy transitions. In food and agriculture, too, there was the development, certainly, of margarine, which ate into the butter market, and we saw some steep opposition from dairy farmers at the time that required margarine makers to actually dye their product pink in order to really scare away consumers and slow demand. So in short, I'd say the history is largely of incumbents trying to really kind of fend off change. There's not many great examples of effective, well-planned, and inclusive transitions overall, unfortunately. I think people are really trying to develop those efforts, both from like a theoretical perspective as well as a practical perspective on the ground for energy, and trying to learn from some of those mistakes from the past.
Great examples, great points. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, Dan. I wanted to, my name's Ron Shigeta, and I just had a couple of observations. One of them is that as you get to know the industry a little better and dig into some of the older statements, it's actually fairly common for the startups to be picking up the idea that actually what happens is that industry is meant to simplify the global distribution supply chain. Right now, if there's a market imbalance, let's say Chinese people don't like white meat as much as they like dark meat. And so for years, they were actually packing chicken breasts onto frozen ship containers and send the United States for consumption and into dog food. And so what we see already is actually a lot of people are talking about how this simplifies that supply chain by manufacturing meat more locally. Certainly, within the borders of a nation that's consuming it rather than transnationally, right? And so I don't think that there's anybody, that's a very common conception. I don't think anybody's planning to concentrate manufacturing in large metro expensive centers. All of these manufacturing facilities have to be on dirt cheap land to keep the cost as low as possible. Will they be in the same place as they are right now? That certainly may not be, but I think that requires some careful breakdown of the people there, because my understanding is meatpacking in the Midwest. Most of these people who are working in these plants are younger, but they're also more recently moved to the region. And so sort of breaking down what some of the damage would be and how easy it would be these people to move to a job that's similar or better paid elsewhere. I mean, I think those are all something that needs some thought before we sort of dig into some of these long-term consequences.
I totally agree. I think those are all great points. And just to the last question earlier also, I think that there are some government programs to provide assistance for disruptions due to international and bilateral trade agreements. So there are federal programs to provide job training and other types of assistance for people who have been affected, for instance, by like the USMCA and by NAFTA, although I think those are largely kind of considered as ineffective or insufficient. And just to your question, I was talking to someone yesterday who works in real estate and construction, and they made the same point, that overall construction costs need to be really low, and to scale up, it's really unimaginable to imagine a commercial scale industry that's exclusively located here in the Bay Area, let alone near New York or really any metro center. So that would really...
That would be a $500 stake.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Thanks.
Well, thank you.